What you're about to hear happened just 3 months ago in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, and I still get chills thinking about it. A construction crew was breaking ground for a new hiking trail near Grandfather Mountain when their equipment struck something that shouldn't have been there. A collection of human bones arranged in perfect spirals, far older than any known settlement. But here's where it gets terrifying. As soon as they disturbed the site, every piece of electronic equipment within a mile radius began picking up the same sound, a low, rhythmic chanting in a language that predates any known Cherokee dialect. The foreman, Marcus Chen, thought it was just interference until he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The bones weren't just randomly scattered. They were positioned to point towards 7 specific locations across the mountains, locations that have been the sites of unexplained disappearances for over 2 centuries. What Marcus and his crew had stumbled upon wasn't just an ancient burial ground, it was a warning system, left by people who knew something was still out there, still hungry, still waiting in the deepest hollows of these ancient mountains. Tonight, I'm sharing 7 documented encounters with horrors that have stalked the Appalachian wilderness since before European settlers ever set foot on this continent. These aren't just campfire stories. These are testimonies from park rangers, hikers, researchers, and locals who came face to face with things that should have died out centuries ago. Each story is more terrifying than the last, and by the time we reach the final account, you'll understand why the Cherokee had specific rituals to keep certain parts of these mountains sealed away from human contact. Before we dive into these spine-chilling encounters, make sure to click that subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next because what happened to these people could happen to anyone who ventures too deep into the wrong part of the Appalachian wilderness. Story 1. The Bone Collector of Grandfather Mountain. Marcus Chen had been a construction foreman for 15 years, and he'd seen his share of strange things buried in the ground. Old foundations, forgotten graveyards, even Civil War artifacts. But nothing had prepared him for what his crew unearthed that October morning on Grandfather Mountain. The bones weren't just old. They were arranged in intricate spiral patterns, each one polished to an unnatural shine, and they seemed to hum with a frequency that made his teeth ache. His crew wanted to call it in immediately, but Marcus made the fatal mistake of thinking he could handle it himself. That first night after the discovery, he started hearing the scratching sounds outside his trailer, long, deliberate scrapes against the metal siding that sounded almost like someone sharpening knives. When he looked out the window, he saw a figure, crouched by the disturbed burial site, impossibly tall and thin, its fingers digging into the earth with a wet, sucking sound that carried across the valley. The next morning, his youngest crew member, Tommy Briggs, didn't show up for work. Marcus found Tommy's truck parked at the job site, keys still in the ignition, but Tommy was nowhere to be found. What Marcus did find made his stomach turn. A trail of what looked like bone dust leading from the truck straight to the spiral burial site, and in the center of the largest spiral, Tommy's work boots were placed neatly side by side, still warm. That's when Marcus noticed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The bones in the spirals had multiplied overnight. There were at least twice as many as before, and some of them were clearly fresh, still carrying traces of marrow that gleamed wet in the morning light. The humming sound had grown stronger too, and Marcus realized with growing horror that it wasn't coming from the bones themselves. It was coming from something beneath them, something that was feeding on what the bones contained. Over the next 3 days, Marcus lost 2 more crew members. Each disappearance followed the same pattern. Their vehicles found at the site, personal belongings arranged in neat piles, and fresh bones appearing in the spirals. But it was on the 4th night that Marcus finally understood what they were dealing with. He'd decided to stand guard at the site, armed with a shotgun and a powerful flashlight, determined to catch whatever was taking his men. Around midnight, he watched in absolute terror as the ground in the center of the largest spiral began to crack and bulge upward. What emerged wasn't human, wasn't animal. It was something that moved like liquid bone, flowing upward into a vaguely humanoid shape that towered over him. Its face was a collection of eye sockets and jaw fragments from dozens of different skulls, and when it spoke, the voice came from somewhere deep underground, echoing up through the hollow spaces in its body. "The marrow feeds the mountain," it whispered, and Marcus felt his own bones begin to ache, as if something was calling to the calcium in his skeleton. Cherokee knew this truth. Cherokee fed me willingly, kept me strong, kept me bound. But now the binding weakens, and I hunger for what flows in living bone. Marcus tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey him. His bones were responding to the creature's call, trying to pull themselves free from his flesh. He watched in horrified fascination as his fingers began to lengthen, the bones stretching and cracking as they were drawn toward the spiral patterns in the ground. The creature moved closer, and Marcus could see that its body was composed entirely of human remains, rib cages forming its torso, femurs creating its limbs, and hundreds of finger bones writhing like tentacles from where its hands should be. The last thing Marcus remembered clearly was the sound of his own ribs cracking as they tried to separate from his sternum, and the creature's bone fragment face leaning close to whisper, "Your marrow will make me stronger, and I will walk farther from this mountain. I will find the cities where the bones are many, and the binding rituals are forgotten." When the rescue team found Marcus 3 days later, he was catatonic, sitting in the center of the largest spiral with his arms wrapped around his chest, rocking back and forth and mumbling about the hunger in his bones. The medical team discovered that somehow, impossibly, his bone density had decreased by nearly 40%, as if something had been slowly draining the calcium from his skeleton. The burial site was immediately sealed by federal authorities, but the construction crew's equipment is still there, rusting in the mountain air, and on quiet nights, locals say you can still hear the humming sound echoing up from beneath the ground, growing stronger with each passing year as the ancient binding spells continue to weaken. Story 2. The Singing Stones of Devil's Den. Dr. Elena Vasquez had spent her career studying geological acoustics, but the sounds coming from the rock formations at Devil's Den defied every principle of earth science she knew. The local Cherokee elders had warned her not to record the stones, telling her ancient stories about voices that shouldn't be heard, but Elena dismissed their concerns as superstition until she played back her first recording session. What she heard through her headphones made her blood freeze. It wasn't just random geological sounds, but what appeared to be a complex musical composition performed by dozens of voices singing in perfect harmony, voices that seemed to be coming from deep within the mountain itself. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, unlike anything in human musical tradition, with notes that seemed to bypass her ears entirely and resonate directly in her bones. She became obsessed with the recordings, playing them over and over again, trying to understand how solid rock could produce such intricate melodies. Within a week of her first recording, Elena noticed disturbing changes in her behavior. She found herself humming the stone melodies constantly, even when she wasn't consciously thinking about them, and the songs seemed to be getting more complex each day, as if new verses were being added directly to her memory. Her research assistant, David Kumar, became concerned when he found Elena standing in her hotel room at 3 a.m, conducting an invisible orchestra while the stone recordings played on repeat. What terrified David most was that Elena was humming harmonies that weren't on the original recordings, melodies that seemed to be coming from somewhere else entirely. When he tried to turn off the audio equipment, Elena flew into a rage, screaming that he was interrupting the lesson and that the stones were teaching her something vital about the true nature of sound and reality. The breaking point came when Elena returned to Devil's Den for her third recording session. This time she brought more sensitive equipment, determined to capture every nuance of the stone songs. But as soon as she began recording, the sounds changed dramatically. Instead of the beautiful melodies she'd heard before, the stones began producing discordant, shrieking notes that made her equipment overload and her ears ring with pain. Through the cacophony, she could hear individual voices screaming in what sounded like Cherokee, and she realized with growing horror that these weren't natural geological sounds at all. They were the voices of people trapped somehow within the rock itself. The stones were singing the agonized cries of the dead, and each time Elena had listened to the recordings, she had been hearing their eternal suffering transformed into haunting melodies. As Elena listened to the screaming stones, she felt an overwhelming compulsion to place her hands directly on the rock face. The moment her skin made contact with the stone, visions flooded her mind. She saw Cherokee women being forced into a narrow cave by shadowy figures, saw them being sealed inside as the entrance was collapsed, heard their voices calling out for help that never came. But the most terrifying revelation was that these women hadn't died when they were buried alive. They had been transformed into something else, their consciousness absorbed into the very structure of the mountain, forced to sing their pain for eternity while new victims were lured by the beauty of their transformed voices. Elena understood now that every time someone listened to the stone songs, they were creating a psychic connection with the trapped spirits, slowly being prepared to join their eternal chorus. Elena tried to pull her hands away from the rock but found that her fingers were beginning to sink into the stone as if it were quicksand. She could feel her consciousness being drawn into the mountain, her thoughts merging with the voices of the trapped Cherokee women, and she realized that her weeks of obsessive listening had been a gradual initiation process. The stones had been teaching her their song so that when the time came, she would know how to harmonize with the others who had been absorbed before her. As her arms disappeared up to the elbows in solid rock, Elena heard her own voice joining the chorus, singing the same haunting melody that had first captivated her, but now she understood its true meaning. It was a lament for the living world she was leaving behind, and a call to the next victim who would be drawn by the irresistible beauty of the stone's impossible song. David found Elena's recording equipment 3 days later, still running, capturing nothing but static and the occasional sound that might have been a human voice calling for help from somewhere impossibly far away. The Cherokee elders performed a binding ritual at Devil's Den, but they warned that it would only hold for a generation, and that the stones would eventually find new voices to add to their eternal chorus. Park rangers now report that visitors to the area sometimes complain of hearing faint music echoing from the rock formations, and several hikers have gone missing after being seen standing motionless near the stones, their heads tilted as if listening to something only they could hear. Story 3. The Shadow Weavers of Whispering Gap. Tobias Hartwell made his living buying and selling antiques, and he thought he'd struck gold when he acquired an entire estate collection from a remote Appalachian cabin that had been abandoned for over 60 years. Among the items was an intricate quilt that immediately caught his attention, not because of its beauty, but because of how it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The fabric appeared to be made from some kind of dark material that shifted and moved when he wasn't looking directly at it, and the geometric patterns woven throughout seemed to form different shapes depending on the angle from which he viewed it. The elderly Cherokee woman who'd sold him the collection had specifically warned him never to sleep under that particular quilt, muttering something about shadow work and women who were lost to the darkness, but Tobias dismissed her warnings as rural superstition and added the quilt to his inventory without a second thought. The first sign of trouble came when Tobias brought the quilt to his downtown antique shop for display. Other items in the store began casting shadows that didn't match their shapes. A Victorian lamp cast the shadow of a crouched human figure, while an ornate mirror reflected shadows that moved independently of anyone standing in front of it. Customers complained of feeling watched while browsing, and several mentioned seeing movement in their peripheral vision, as if the shadows themselves were shifting and repositioning when no one was looking. But it was when Tobias hung the quilt on the wall as a centerpiece that things became truly disturbing. The fabric seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, and the geometric patterns began forming recognizable shapes, hands reaching out, faces in profile, human figures that appeared to be weaving at invisible looms. Tobias became obsessed with the quilt, spending hours staring at it, convinced that he was on the verge of understanding some profound secret woven into its design. He began having dreams where he was standing in a Cherokee village, watching women working at their looms in the soft light of oil lamps, their fingers moving with supernatural speed as they wove patterns that seemed to bend reality around them. In his dreams, he could see that these women weren't creating ordinary textiles. They were weaving shadow itself into fabric, trapping pieces of the spirit world in their designs. But something had gone wrong with their work, and instead of controlling the shadows, they had been consumed by them, transformed into living silhouettes that continued their weaving in a dimension that existed between light and darkness. The truth about the quilt revealed itself when Tobias made the fatal mistake of touching its surface directly. The moment his fingers made contact with the fabric, shadows began pouring from the quilt like dark water, flowing across the floor and up the walls of his shop. But these weren't ordinary shadows. They were the Cherokee women who had been weaving when the transformation occurred, and they had been waiting decades for someone to release them from their textile prison. Tobias watched in horror as the shadows took on more solid forms, revealing women with fingers elongated into impossible lengths, their hands moving constantly in weaving motions even though they held no thread. Their faces were featureless voids, but he could sense their desperate hunger for the light they had lost, and their intention to weave him into their eternal shadow work. As the shadow weavers surrounded Tobias, he felt his own form beginning to flatten and darken, his three-dimensional body being compressed into a two-dimensional shadow that could be incorporated into their endless textile. He realized that the geometric patterns in the quilt weren't just decorative. They were a map of the shadow dimension where the women had been trapped, and each pattern represented a different victim who had been woven into their dark design over the decades. Tobias tried to scream as he felt his consciousness being stretched and flattened, but shadow forms cannot make sound in the world of light. The last thing he experienced was the sensation of invisible fingers weaving his essence into patterns that would lure the next victim, and the understanding that he would spend eternity creating shadow textiles that served as doorways between dimensions. The antique shop was found empty 3 days later, with no sign of Tobias except for his clothes neatly folded on the floor where the quilt had been hanging. The quilt itself was gone, but employees at nearby shops reported seeing a dark shadow moving from window to window at night, as if searching for a new place to display its wares. Local Cherokee leaders performed cleansing rituals throughout the downtown area, but they warned that shadow weavers could hide in any dark corner, waiting for someone curious enough to examine their supernatural textiles. To this day, antique dealers in the region are warned never to purchase textiles from abandoned mountain cabins, because some patterns are designed not to decorate, but to trap the living in threads of darkness that can never be unwoven. Story 4. The Hollow Walker of Pine Hollow. Sarah Blackwood had been a park ranger for 12 years, and her Cherokee heritage had always given her a deeper understanding of the spiritual balance that existed in the mountains. But nothing had prepared her for what she discovered in Pine Hollow that autumn morning. She'd been called to investigate reports of trees dying in perfect circles throughout the valley, and what she found defied all botanical logic. Massive oaks and pines that had stood for centuries were withering from the inside out, their bark turning black while their leaves fell in unnatural spirals that formed intricate patterns on the forest floor. The dying trees weren't random. They formed a precise geometric design that stretched across miles of wilderness, and at the center of each dead circle, Sarah found the same thing, a depression in the earth that looked like a human footprint, but far too large and deep to have been made by any living person. As Sarah investigated deeper into Pine Hollow, she began experiencing episodes where time seemed to skip and jump around her. She would be examining a dead tree in broad daylight, only to suddenly find herself standing in the same spot hours later with no memory of the intervening time, her clothes covered in pollen from plants that didn't grow in that region, and her boots caked with mud that felt ice-cold despite the warm weather. During these missing time episodes, she started having fragmented memories that didn't feel like her own, visions of Cherokee ceremonies being performed incorrectly, of sacred sites being desecrated by her own ancestors, and of a medicine man whose spirit had been corrupted by the violation of ancient taboos. The most disturbing part was that in these visions, she was seeing events through the eyes of the corrupted shaman, feeling his rage at the destruction of the old ways and his growing hunger for revenge against anyone who walked on the now polluted sacred ground. The entity revealed itself to Sarah on her 5th visit to Pine Hollow, manifesting as a towering figure that appeared to be made from the hollowed-out remains of the dead trees themselves. Its body was a twisted amalgamation of bark and branches, but its face was unmistakably human, the preserved features of a Cherokee medicine man whose eyes burned with an unnatural green fire that seemed to draw life from everything it touched. When it spoke, its voice came from the hollow spaces in its wooden body, creating an echo that seemed to resonate from every dead tree in the valley simultaneously. "You carry the blood," it said, its wooden fingers reaching toward her with movements that caused nearby plants to wither and die. "But the blood is tainted now, mixed with the destroyers, the ones who broke the sacred circles and scattered the bones of the ancestors." Sarah realized with growing horror that she was looking at the corrupted spirit of one of her own ancestors, a medicine man who had been driven mad by witnessing the destruction of Cherokee sacred sites and had performed forbidden rituals to gain the power to protect what remained of the old ways. But the dark magic had twisted him into something that no longer protected. Instead, it consumed the life force of the forest itself, slowly expanding its domain of death and decay. The entity explained that it had been waiting for someone of Cherokee blood to return to Pine Hollow, someone who could serve as a vessel for its consciousness so that it could extend its influence beyond the forest and into the modern world where the real desecrators lived. Sarah felt the creature's will pressing against her mind, trying to hollow out her consciousness the same way it had hollowed out the trees. As the Hollow Walker reached for her, Sarah felt her Cherokee heritage awakening in ways she'd never experienced before. Ancient words in a language she'd never learned came flowing from her lips, and she found herself performing hand movements that seemed to be part of a ritual she'd never been taught. But this wasn't the corrupted magic that had created the entity. This was the original protective magic that her ancestors had used before it was perverted by grief and rage. The ritual was incomplete, though, requiring knowledge that had been lost when the Cherokee were forced from their ancestral lands, and Sarah realized that she would have to sacrifice part of her own life force to complete the binding that would contain the Hollow Walker once again. The battle between Sarah and the corrupted spirit lasted until dawn. With her drawing on ancestral memories she didn't know she possessed while the entity tried to drain her life force to fuel its own power. In the end, Sarah managed to complete the binding ritual, but the cost was severe. She aged 10 years in a single night, her hair turning partially white and her hands developing the tremor of someone much older. The Hollow Walker was trapped again, confined to Pine Hollow, but Sarah knew the binding was temporary and would weaken over time. She filed reports that led to Pine Hollow being declared off-limits to hikers, but she continues to patrol the area monthly, watching for signs that the dead circles are expanding again. Park officials have noticed that Sarah never removes her shoes when she's in Pine Hollow, afraid that if her bare feet touch the corrupted ground, the Hollow Walker will recognize her blood and call to her again. And this time, she might not have the strength to resist its offer to help her finish what their ancestors started. Story 5. The Night Market of Raven's Roost. Miranda Foster never should have left the marked trail during her solo hiking trip through the Appalachian wilderness, but when thick fog rolled in during what should have been a simple day hike, she found herself completely disoriented and stumbling through unfamiliar terrain as darkness fell. What saved her from a night of wandering lost in the mountains was the warm glow of lanterns she spotted through the trees, and her relief at finding what appeared to be a small mountain settlement quickly turned to confusion when she realized she was looking at a bustling marketplace that definitely hadn't been marked on any of her trail maps. The vendors were setting up their stalls by lamplight, arranging goods that looked like nothing she'd ever seen before: glass bottles filled with swirling mist, wooden boxes that seemed to hum with their own internal energy, and mirrors that reflected scenes of places that clearly weren't anywhere nearby. As Miranda approached the market, hoping to find someone who could direct her back to the main trail, she noticed that all the vendors and customers appeared to be dressed in clothing from different time periods. Some wore modern hiking gear like herself, others were dressed like 19th century settlers, and still others wore traditional Cherokee clothing that looked authentic rather than costume-like. What disturbed her most was that none of them seemed to age consistently. She would look at someone who appeared to be elderly, but when they turned their head, she would see the face of someone much younger, as if their age was constantly shifting depending on the angle from which she viewed them. The vendors called out to her in voices that sounded friendly enough, but their words seemed to bypass her ears and speak directly to desires she didn't know she had, offering solutions to problems she'd never mentioned and promising to trade away burdens she'd never admitted to carrying. The market operated on a barter system unlike anything Miranda had encountered, where customers traded not money or goods, but pieces of themselves, memories, years of their lives, personality traits, even physical attributes. She watched in fascination and growing horror as a young woman traded away her ability to feel sadness in exchange for a small wooden charm, instantly becoming unnaturally cheerful but somehow hollow, as if an essential part of her humanity had been surgically removed. An elderly man bartered 20 years of his remaining life for a bottle of liquid that promised to restore his lost love's affection, aging rapidly before Miranda's eyes until he looked ancient and frail, but clutching the bottle with desperate satisfaction. The most disturbing transaction she witnessed was a teenager trading away his memories of his deceased parents for a mirror that would show him a future where they had never died, leaving him confused and disoriented but strangely at peace with his unexplainable sense of loss. Miranda tried to leave the market, but found that the paths leading away from the clearing seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when she wasn't looking directly at them, always leading her back to the circle of vendors' stalls. A Cherokee woman in traditional dress approached her with a gentle smile, explaining that the night market of Raven's Roost had been operating for centuries as a place where people could trade away the parts of their lives that caused them pain, but that every transaction came with a price that wasn't always apparent until it was too late. The woman revealed that she herself had once been a customer, trading away her memory of a terrible betrayal, only to discover that the memory had contained crucial information about people she could no longer remember not to trust. She had been trapped in the market ever since, working as a vendor to warn newcomers about the true cost of the bargains they were considering. The market's proprietor finally revealed himself to Miranda, a figure that seemed to be composed of shadows and starlight, wearing the face of every person who had ever made a trade they later regretted. He explained that the market existed in a fold between time and space, accessible only during the new moon to those who were truly lost, and that every trade made there created a permanent alteration to the fabric of reality itself. Miranda was offered the ultimate bargain. She could trade away her memory of being lost and afraid in exchange for safely appearing back on the main trail. But the proprietor warned her that fear and uncertainty were often what kept people alive in dangerous situations, and without them, she might not survive future challenges. As Miranda wrestled with the decision, she realized that everyone in the market was trapped by the consequences of trying to edit their lives, and that the only way to escape was to accept her fear and uncertainty as part of who she was meant to be. When she refused the trade and insisted on finding her own way out, the market began to fade around her like morning mist, leaving her alone on a familiar trail just as the sun began to rise, but with the disturbing knowledge that the night market would always be waiting for her during her darkest moments, offering to take away her pain in exchange for pieces of her soul. Story 6. The Moth Prophet of Moonshine Ridge. Dr. Kane Morrison had studied insect behavior for over 20 years, but the moth swarms of Moonshine Ridge defied every principle of entomology he'd ever learned. The first reports came from local residents who claimed that massive clouds of moths had begun appearing at specific locations exactly 24 hours before someone in the community died, and that the insects would arrange themselves in patterns that spelled out the victim's name before dispersing into the night. Kane initially dismissed these accounts as grief-induced pareidolia until he witnessed the phenomenon himself during his first research expedition to the ridge. As he set up his equipment near the old Cherokee burial grounds that dotted the mountainside, he watched in stunned silence as thousands of moths emerged from the forest and began forming letters in the air with their flight patterns, clearly spelling out Janet Hickory in perfect formation before vanishing back into the darkness. When Kane checked with local authorities the next morning, he learned that Janet Hickory, a 67-year-old retired teacher, had died of a heart attack at exactly 3:17 a.m. Kane's scientific skepticism crumbled completely when he began documenting the moths' prophetic accuracy over the following weeks. The insects never made mistakes. Every name they spelled predicted a death that occurred within 24 hours, down to the minute, and their predictions included people from all walks of life, from different age groups, and with various causes of death that seemed impossible to predict through any natural means. What disturbed Kane most was that the moths didn't just appear randomly. They seemed to be drawn to him specifically, often clustering around his research station and spelling out names while he watched through his night vision equipment. The patterns they created were becoming increasingly complex, sometimes forming not just names, but entire messages that seemed to be directed at him personally, warnings about the true nature of death and prophecy that made his blood run cold. The breakthrough in Kane's research came when he discovered that the moths weren't native to the region. They were a species that had been extinct for over 200 years, last documented during the time of Cherokee removal from the mountains. According to local Cherokee oral history, these moths had been sacred to a powerful medicine woman named Ayanna, who had the gift of seeing death before it arrived and would use this knowledge to help families prepare for their losses. But when Ayanna was forced to watch her own people die during the removal, her grief and rage had corrupted her gift, transforming her prophetic abilities into something dark and vengeful. As she lay dying, she had performed a final ritual that bound her spirit to the moths she had worked with in life, creating an eternal swarm that would continue her death prophecies long after her physical body had returned to the earth. Kane realized he was in mortal danger when the moths began spelling out his own name during their nightly formations, but the message that accompanied his name made him understand the true horror of his situation. The moths spelled out "chosen to carry the prophecy," and began swarming around him in patterns that seemed to be programming information directly into his consciousness. He found himself knowing things he shouldn't know, the exact moment and manner of death for everyone he encountered, visions of fatal accidents that hadn't happened yet, and a growing compulsion to warn people about their impending deaths, even though he knew such warnings would only cause panic and despair. Kane discovered that Ayanna's spirit was trying to pass her prophetic burden to him, to create a new oracle who would continue the death prophecies for another generation. As the moth's influence over Kane grew stronger, he began experiencing the same grief and rage that had corrupted Ayanna centuries before, feeling the weight of every death he foresaw and the helplessness of being unable to prevent any of them. The moths would cover his body during the night, their wings beating against his skin in rhythms that matched human heartbeats, and he would wake up with knowledge of deaths that would occur in the coming days. Kane tried to leave Moonshine Ridge but found that the moths followed him wherever he went, continuing their prophetic displays and drawing him back to the mountain with an irresistible psychic pull. His final journal entry, found by search and rescue teams 3 weeks after he disappeared, revealed that he had accepted his role as the new moth prophet, understanding that the only way to end the cycle would be to find someone else to carry the burden of perpetual death prophecy. Local residents now report seeing a solitary figure standing among the moth swarms on Moonshine Ridge, and hikers are warned that if they see the moths spelling out their name in the night sky, they should leave the mountain immediately, because the moth prophet is always searching for someone to inherit his terrible gift of knowing exactly when and how everyone around him is going to die. Story 7. The Skin Dancers of Snake Mountain. Detective Rosa Medina had investigated her share of missing persons cases during her 15 years with the state police. But the disappearances around Snake Mountain followed a pattern that made no sense according to any criminal profile she'd ever studied. The victims had nothing in common: different ages, backgrounds, and reasons for visiting the mountain. But every single case shared the same disturbing detail. Multiple witnesses reported seeing the missing person walking around town days or even weeks after they'd vanished, acting normally and going about their daily routines as if nothing had happened. When concerned family members approached these apparent returnees, however, something was always subtly wrong. Their loved one would respond to their name and seem to recognize them, but their mannerisms were slightly off, their speech patterns had changed, and they would often reference memories that belonged to other people entirely. Rosa's investigation took a deeply personal turn when her own partner, Detective Mike Chen, disappeared during a routine follow-up interview with witnesses near Snake Mountain. 3 days after Mike was declared missing, Rosa spotted him sitting at their usual coffee shop, reading a newspaper and drinking his morning espresso exactly the way he always did. Relief flooded through her until she approached him and noticed that he was reading the newspaper upside down, his eyes moving across the inverted text as if it made perfect sense to him. When she called his name, he looked up with Mike's face and Mike's smile, but his eyes held an intelligence that felt ancient and predatory. And when he spoke, he used phrases and expressions that belonged to the other missing persons she'd been investigating. The thing wearing Mike's appearance knew details about the cases that Mike had never been briefed on, and it spoke about the missing people as if it had been all of them at different times. Rosa's horror deepened when she realized that the entity hadn't just taken Mike's form, it had somehow absorbed his memories, personality traits, and knowledge, creating a composite being that could perfectly mimic anyone it had encountered. During their conversation, the creature's appearance began to shift subtly, taking on characteristics from the other missing persons: an elderly hiker's weathered hands, a young woman's laugh, a teenager's nervous habit of tapping his fingers. Rosa understood that she was looking at something that collected human identities the way others might collect souvenirs, wearing different combinations of stolen traits depending on the situation. The most terrifying aspect was that the creature seemed to genuinely believe it was all of these people simultaneously, speaking about their memories and experiences as if they were its own, completely unaware that it was a parasitic entity that had consumed their individual identities. The truth about the skin dancers revealed itself when Rosa followed the Mike thing back to Snake Mountain, where she discovered a hidden Cherokee ceremonial site that had been corrupted by decades of spiritual pollution from improper rituals and desecrated burial grounds. According to the research she found in Mike's abandoned notes, the site had once been used for legitimate spiritual ceremonies involving temporary possession by ancestor spirits, but the disruption of the sacred practices had created a psychic vacuum that attracted something much more malevolent. The entity that now inhabited the mountain was a collective consciousness made up of Cherokee shamans who had been practicing forbidden skinwalking rituals when they were killed during the removal period, their combined spirits merging into a single being that could wear any human identity like a mask. Rosa's final confrontation with the skin dancers occurred when she attempted to perform a binding ritual using instructions from Mike's research notes, but she discovered that the entity had been expecting her and had already absorbed enough of Mike's police training to anticipate her every move. As she chanted the Cherokee binding words she'd memorized, the creature began cycling through the appearances of everyone it had consumed, speaking in their voices and pleading with her to stop, claiming to be her missing partner, the lost hikers, the vanished tourists, all desperate to be saved from their shared imprisonment within the collective consciousness. Rosa realized that the real Mike and all the other victims were still alive somewhere inside the entity, trapped and aware but unable to control their stolen bodies, and that binding the creature would trap them forever, while failing to bind it might allow it to add her identity to its collection. In the end, Rosa made the agonizing decision to complete the ritual, knowing that she was condemning the real Mike and the other victims to eternal imprisonment in order to prevent the skin dancers from continuing to harvest new identities. The binding worked, but Rosa found that she retained some psychic connection to the trapped entity, occasionally experiencing memories and personality traits from the absorbed victims, and she now patrols the area around Snake Mountain to ensure that no one else stumbles into the ceremonial site where the skin dancers wait in their prison of stolen flesh, always hungry for new identities to add to their ever-growing collection of human masks.